had an oddly material challenge actually getting this essay started during the time set apart for the sensitive moment of starting to write. I had to forbid myself taking any walks, but walking and thinking are really closely bound together for me. And the air quality kept registering as bad in my city. And the Canadian wildfires just kept on sending the smoke down to us in New York. Forest fires have happened in Canada before, many times, but the extremity of this boreal forest burning was being fed by unprecedented 100-degree Fahrenheit heat in northern Canada, not southern California. And the fire, of course, is devouring billions of the trees we so need to suck excess carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and the overuse of air conditioners is pumping a whole lot more of that CO2 into the atmosphere. Quite vicious circles. Circles I hope are not spinning even faster now. I haven't checked the latest news on those fires. And speaking of terrestrial circles, another bit of ecological news hit home at the same time. The axis on which the Earth turns has abruptly tilted. I think you all heard of this. For decades, we read, scientists have been watching the average position of our planet's rotational axis, the imaginary rod around which it turns, gently wander south. Suddenly, though, it made a sharp turn and started heading east. Researchers came to a startling realization. Accelerated melting of the polar ice sheets and mountain glaciers had changed the way mass was distributed around the planet enough to influence its spin. Some of the same scientists have identified another factor, of course, colossal quantities of water pumped out of the ground for crops and households. And satellites have revealed the staggering extent, quote, to which groundwater supplies have declined in particular regions, including India and the Central Valley of California. Of course, the loss of groundwater will have predictably horrifying effects gradually, but the tilt is not predicted to have any big impact on life. It reads now as an effect rather than a cause of ecological degradation. So geoscientist Jonathan Overpeck noted that changes to the Earth's axis highlight how real and profoundly large an impact humans are having on the planet. So I figured, why not read the tilt of the Earth's axis as a disturbing metaphor of that impact? Our species is throwing the planet itself out of kilter. Ecological imbalance has now gone astronomical. Tilting planet, melting glaciers, declining groundwater, historic scales of fire and flood. I am, of course, wondering whether such a multiplication of crisis has something to do with Whitehead's serene metaphysical claim about the discordant multiplicity of actual things. And if so, might Whitehead's notion of discord shed any helpful light on our ecological crisis? Because, of course, such examples as I've offered may read in this scholarly context like pragmatically forced anachronisms, or they may seem to reduce ontological vision to mere fleeting exemplifications. My titular text comes as part of the climactic, not climatic, conclusion of Process and Reality, where we read, again, this discordant multiplicity of actual things, requiring each other and neglecting each other, utilizing and discarding, perishing and yet claiming life as obstinate matter of fact. Well, what better than global warming exemplifies that discordant multiplicity such that our requiring the other, human and non-human, our utilizing and our discarding, is turning our planet into a garbage dump of neglect. And so the metaphysical discord takes on an alarming material momentum, so much so that it tilts the very axis of the earth. Yet, ecological destruction, a sheer evil, cannot serve as a full illustration of Whitehead's discordant multiplicity. In the next paragraph, his serenely formulated discord gets folded into the larger cosmic variety of opposites in its irreducible coincidentia oppositorum of good and evil, joy and sorrow, of multiplicity and unity. So I am hoping that to embrace this discordant multiplicity of things is not to render ecological destruction an inevitability, nor to dignify it with cosmological grandeur. Rather, it is to keep the planetary scale and therefore the mounting local stakes in view. But simultaneously, another discord, a meta-discord, inflects, of course, the present reflection, and that is the never unlikely discord among us between presumptive Whiteheadians on just what role to give ecological damage vis-a-vis metaphysical cosmology. The very question may seem not just anachronistic vis-a-vis Whitehead's time and that of the whole history of philosophy, but out of place and repetitive. Barbara already did this adequately for us. So let my branding of this reflection with climate crisis perform a bit of its own discord. But the point is neither to ruffle feathers nor to pluck them, but actually to strengthen solidarity, and eco-social solidarity, both between and beyond Whiteheadians, even beyond humans. After all, Process and Reality introduces already on page 7 the obvious solidarity of the world, sometimes less obvious than others. And the summer crises bring home how Whitehead's notion of discordance may be key to a vibrant notion of solidarity, and therefore to a solidarity amidst crisis, to what I want to call a solidarity rich in discord. Indeed, we may find that the root meaning of crisis as decision will support a double solidarity, that between Whiteheadians at least, and all earthlings on principle. As it twists through Whitehead's own notions of evil, of God, and of redemption, such a solidarity can only grow from, and therefore strengthen, a relationality of deep difference. So Whiteheadians might agree that current forms of solidarity across the liberal progressive spectrum, including eco-social struggles, suffer from a lack of both breadth and depth, and that this lack pertains not just to party politics, but to the great movements focused around their issues of singular importance. But this lack is readily thought of as a need for greater unity within and between greater unity within and between identitarian movements. I'm wondering if, to the contrary, solidarity, with its temptation to single-issue politics, actually suffers from the lack of an adequate understanding of the discordant multiplicity of actual things. The continental discourse of différance, of course, has done great philosophical work to articulate and honor differences, however discordant, between the subject and whichever other. But with the exception of Deleuzian pure multiplicities, différence tended to remain anthropocentric and also separative, suspicious that any language of interdependence or of constitutive relation is serving as a front for homogenization, the reduction, after all, of difference to the same. A reasonable concern, yet as I have for too long argued, originally motivated by feminist politics, that very suspicion fronts for an egoic separatism, a relational rather than a separative difference, an entangled difference, multiplies alterity precisely by internalizing it. Indeed, process thought entails a vastly broader multiplicity of differences than most post-structuralism, in that we think of all members of the universe as subjects of irreducible difference. Ontologically broader, but also deeper, for that unruly diversity registers as a discord in the very structure of actuality. Whatever suspicions post-structuralists harbor against the homogenizing force of any metaphysics, I think we probably agree that there is little danger in the Whiteheadian model of a simple unity of or between its subjects. The danger for us might rather be of a dissipative differentiation, a multiplication of discordant multiplicities, pressing against needed solidarities. It is my hunch, however, that a more intentional avowal of the ontological discord shows itself key to the solidarities we most need. Solidarities intellectual and political, personal and public, and insistently natural and cultural. For of course, I am here concerned above all with the eco-social solidarity that we seek in order not to cross the looming apocalyptic threshold of too late. The open-endedness of time itself in Whitehead does not rule out a catastrophic closure of human history, climactic or climatic. But then in the face of that openness, we must ask, might the Whiteheadian notion of a discord inherent to the multiplicity of actual occasions subtly sabotage the hope of sustainable solidarities just when we most need them? For after all, for Whitehead, the nature of evil is, natural. The characters of things, he writes, are mutually obstructive. So would such naturalization of competition not also naturalize evil as inevitable, and so maybe render any adequate solidarity close to impossible? Well, I'm arguing to the contrary, that by coming to better terms philosophically and practically with the discord that mounts with the intensification of difference, we might be able to help create far more versatile, sustainable, effectual, and bigger solidarities. Then we might outgrow politically the calls for mere unity, and with them the insistence on oneness in important matters. That mere unity, of course, always mirrors its opposite, difference as mere division. Solidarity then becomes all too solid, even, mon Dieu, substantialist, pressing for unity over and against the unacceptable other. Such unifying intensity drives much of the identitarian politics for which a sex or a gender or a race or a class or, yes, even environment is all that really matters. But of course, there are truly unacceptable differences for us as well, even as, well, unacceptable differences, oppositions that in the US trump solidarity. And yet there, the call actually then to swing voters remains key. So that the point is not that solidarity is in practice always possible, except ontologically. Whitehead is, after all, not highlighting discord between actual entities or societies of them, but looking at it within the becoming occasion, where he says the depths of life require a process of selection. Decision happens at the heart of things. And so there is a discord within every experience, for however unconsciously, vast social and ecological differences register as internal to the becoming subject. So the tilt of the Earth's axis twists you. So it is worth considering the possibility that attention to that dynamism of discord in decision is socially and politically crucial. Maybe in our modest way, Whiteheadians can help generate a public language of solidarity that seeks not unity, but rather cooperation, coordination, intensification of interconnection of issues and of their publics. And I'd be tempted to start citing all the websites that John Cobb has been involved in starting up and generating and their activist intentions. And that means that I may still, for example, select gender or LGBTQI matters or race or disability or economics as my primary social issue, without thereby compromising solidarity with, say, your primary commitment to ecological justice. The African American womanist notion of intersectionality named this complexity of solidarity early and beautifully. And indeed, what has the process cosmos signified all along but an intersection of intersections? And process was recognized for its African American womanist potential early by Monica Coleman, and for its eco-womanist form by Karen Baker Fletcher. New intersections are always being woven of the old ones because decisions are happening in every occasion, and mostly unconsciously. With humans, that unconsciousness readily intensifies the twist of discord into violence at the very point of decision. Process thought does, on principle, deepen consciousness, knowing together. What a becoming subject knows is always already a togetherness of difference. Whiteheadian thought reaches a too limited public, of course, to make the difference that consciousness, knowing together of difference can allow, but its effects are not just trivial or abstract. Recall also that the leading environmental activist Bill McKibben offered a keynote at the International Whitehead Conference, Seizing an Alternative, of 2015. So in resistance to various evils, it may not, after all, be irrelevant for active and activist solidarity that decision is required moment by moment at the heart of any life. For, Whitehead says, selection is at once the measure of evil and the process of its evasion. Decision, in its original sense of prenane, making a cut, perhaps captures the edge at which discord may turn violent or oppressive, or may cut away from destructiveness. Of course, the Greek prenane is also the root of crisis. In exposing the element of decision, crisis can function as a call for responsibility. Therefore, I try to talk of climate crisis rather than climate catastrophe. Crisis as crisis, decision, signifies the selection amidst conflicting potentials, and also its importance as we find ourselves at a decisive moment in history. And in this period, when our collective decisions will either cut away, consciously and otherwise, more or less, the chances of a healthy planetary future, or will select policies that render a green future more or less actually not abstractly possible by actualizing its eternal objects. Either way, the selection carries decisive importance. Yet the evasion of evil is no simple choice between the good and the bad, nor are our ecological choices. I'm standing up here talking climate, and yet, of course, I flew here. And all of our decisions accumulate within the gigantic division that Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature. He introduces this cut as that against which his whole theory of prehensions embodies a protest. Not surprisingly, therefore, the leading continental eco-philosopher has selected that particular bit of Whitehead to cite. I am referring to Bruno Latour in his 2017 Facing Gaia. He is discussing what he calls the strange opinion that has made it possible to deanimate one sector deemed objective and inert, and to overanimate another sector deemed to be subjective, conscious, and free. It is this strange distribution, which Whitehead called the bifurcation of nature, that weighs 4 centuries later on every interpretation of the Gaia theory. End of quote. Latour is carefully here defending actually the environmental prophet Lovelock, who was so dismissively mocked along with Lynn Margulis for their creation of the Gaia hypothesis, which proposes that living and non-living parts of the earth form a complex single system that can be thought of as a single organism. To be thought of as an organism, Latour insists, does not mean to be simply identified as one. So the challenge lies in what he calls the impossible question: how to obtain effects of connection among agencies without relying on an untenable conception of the whole. Connectedness is not oneness, he repeats and repeats. Latour draws on Whitehead precisely in order to think beyond the bifurcation without falling into the alternative of a planetary oneness, however organic. We have to do precisely not with a single life, but with connectivity among agencies. The planetary intersection of intersections does not, in other words, reduce to a single organism, nor to one actual entity. So Gaia, for Latour, does not name a mythic goddess or any sort of person, but a composition that encompasses all living entities without unifying them within its fragile envelope. And it's here that Latour quotes Shelley. This everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, in the wild woods, among the mountains lone, where waterfalls around it leap forever. And you no doubt recognize that poem as quoted in Science and the Modern World. But Latour then performs a creepy supplement. The everlasting universe of things, he writes, we mustn't count on this any longer. We have stopped believing that waterfalls will leap forever. And so now we no longer see human beings bustling about on the stage of an everlasting nature, but humans obstinately deaf and dispassionately seated, immobile, while the past setting of their past intrigues is disappearing at a frightening pace. I imagine Whitehead would appreciate, with a mournful compassion, this update. Latour discerns a way between the de-animating hegemony of common sense and capitalism on the one side, and on the other, the over-animated new agey harmony of a shallow romanticism. I am thinking that the animating force of such a third way will be intensified without becoming over-animated if we recognize its participation in the discordant multiplicity of things. A Whiteheadian animacy is not just akin to, but an influence upon what Jane Bennett, a leading new materialist, calls the vibrancy of matter. And in this post-humanist, explicit neo-animism, the aliveness, indeed the mattering, cannot be abstracted from the internal dynamic of discourse, as Bennett insists. Attention to that discord, therefore, should let Whiteheadians attend more mindfully to the relation between two divergent kinds of discord, that of our civilization's bifurcation of nature, and that within so-called nature itself, of that problematic word, which Latour, of course, was a leading deconstructor of. So specifically, that bifurcation within nature of all earthlings within the selective animacies of Gaia. Is there then a kind of socio-cosmological resonance of these discords? I think we must, with Whitehead, read the discord created by our exploitation of the non-human as one massive expression of an elemental struggle of selection. But it does not, I hope, therefore justify the evil of neoliberal eco-destruction as somehow Darwinianly natural, inevitable. I am wondering, rather, if that socio-cosmic resonance, far from naturalizing and therefore quietly blessing the evil of human greed systems, lends elemental force to the struggle for eco-social solidarity. The question, I think, comes down to the matter of evil, maybe even to theodicy. Evil is for Whitehead not just the effect of the discord in its character of mutual obstruction. The ultimate evil, he writes, in the temporal world is deeper than any specific evil. It lies in the fact that the past fades. Therefore, he's saying, the challenge of decision becomes acute, for the process of selection is a process of elimination. So even in an ecologically healthy time, there is no avoiding sometimes deadly competition between human creatures and otherwise. So our Anthropocene violence will not be quelled by mere negations of its negations. Some confrontation with that ultimate evil cannot be avoided. The fate of everyone, everything into the past. So confronting our mortality seems to become all the more important. And therefore, some ecological thinkers, like process-tainted theologian Jake Erickson in Ireland, insist on the importance of climate grief for any sustainable struggle, for a sustainable habitat. In the glare of mass extinctions and other eco-irreversibilities, grieving the mounting losses may be necessary to keep us from passing through the final portals of too late. Still, I must ask, does Whitehead, in thus accounting for evil at an ontological, deeply pre-human level, inject a dangerous, contradictory inevitablism, despite the radical openness of his cosmos? Does perpetual perishing turn out to be the real perpetrator? Does the ontology of finitude naturalize and indirectly justify our repressions and abuses of limits? Or we might instead clarify that this ultimate evil, lying in the fact that the past fades, does not render the fading itself evil? That finitude is rather the condition of evil's possibility? Then this mindfulness of the natural depths, rooted in death of evil, can help to deconstruct both the exceptionalism of human death and also the moralism of our conventional sense of evil. But another, not unrelated concern arises. Might we discern a certain discord between the notion of perpetual perishing and Hannah Arendt's prioritization of natality over mortality? Ever worry about that? Does her critique of the philosophical tradition's emphasis on death apply to Whitehead? Certainly, English does not sustain a parallel perpetual birthing. That verb form seems too informal. Yet the perpetual perishing, we can argue, comes inseparable from a just as perpetual becoming, arguably natal in its insistent newness. As we try to intensify current solidarities and give birth to new ones, we embrace great and greater registers of difference. No one world in sight. And such pluralism inevitably increases the discord and its multiplicity. Such is the nature of the intensity we desire, not just for solidarity, but for a meaningfully animate existence. Yet again, Whitehead's attention to the inevitable shadow side of discord roots evil deep into nature. The evil of the world, he writes, is that those elements which are translucent so far as transmission is concerned, in themselves are of slight weight, and that those elements with individual weight, by their discord, impose upon vivid immediacy the obligation that it fade into night. So harmonic translucence links up with triviality, while more weighty individuations press into discord, and so into its opacities and its obstructions. But how does this cause the fade into the past? Doesn't every actual entity perish, however trivial? Perhaps the point is that the more vivid, more animated, because more differentiated actualities actually feel that fade as loss, possibly the explanation. Then Whitehead writes, "He giveth his beloved sleep." You know, that's a quite sarcastic citation of Psalm 127, which actually reads, "It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he, God, gives sleep to his beloved." Or that could be translated even, provides for them during their sleep. So the psalm is not indicating a fade out, but a restorative rest. Yet after all, neither does this beloved simply perish. Despite the discord of unavoidable decision, the selection, Whitehead writes, is elimination as the first step towards another temporal order seeking to minimize obstructive modes. Selection is at once the measure of evil and the process of its evasion. In its ontological rootedness, evil can be decided against at any moment. That's good news amidst today's ecological perishing. Good news of a quite modest, non-triumphalist sort. There is implied, of course, no theological triumph of an ultimate omega, final New Jerusalem, eschatological closure. Yet there is nonetheless an unmistakably theistic disclosure. Whitehead is calling it the step towards another temporal order, one that seeks to minimize obstructive modes. That other temporal order can be identified in context in too simple a way with the consequent nature of God. In context, it carries the real possibility of a socio-ecology in which discord does not devolve into systemic violence and exploitation. Not of utopia, but the topos of a complex structure of harmony, such that, as he writes, deficiency in the solidarity of individuals with each other does not get the last word. Neither does the consequent nature as such. Hence that fourth phase at the end of the book. The basileia ton uranon with us today. The fellow sufferer. The love that floods back into the world. That final application of the doctrine of objective immortality is full of affect. So its reciprocal relation is hardly identifiable with the abstraction of the eternal objects of the first phase, deficient in actuality. Yet this fourth phase, not at all unmoved, surely carries in its flow the new initial aim, without getting tangled in the relation of the primordial possibility to the consequent superjectivity. I just want to claim here that what feels key is that in the actual occasion, in his words, the sense of worth beyond itself is immediately enjoyed as an overpowering element in the individual self-attainment. So I'm thinking, what could better animate social and ecological solidarity than this touch of enjoyment, this participatory hint of the desired future in the present? With or without the God language, might it add some buzz to the potentiality for what Vandana Shiva calls earthly democracy, in which all creatures are granted their intrinsic value for themselves, never mere means to others' ends. I wonder if the sense of worth immediately enjoyed, even overpoweringly, is crucial for empowering our solidarities rich in discord, maybe even with non-humans. The kingdom of heaven is with us today, not supernaturally, but superjectively, companionably, even enjoyably. But of course, in many contexts, Whitehead, and to some extent this one, Whitehead's God talk will hinder more than it helps. And it is in those last pages that Whitehead draws on one of the most problematic dogmas of Christianity. In his words, the notion of redemption through suffering, which haunts the world. It was a Whitehead-educated feminist theology that launched in the 80s the critique, not of Whitehead, but of the atonement theory of redemption through the blood of Christ. A God who requires suffering as the price of salvation makes a mockery of love. But Whitehead is not arguing for that theory. He has no omnipotent father inflict suffering as the price of salvation. And his luring, rather than controlling deity, has delivered perhaps the only truly credible theological answer to the problem of theodicy. No, Whitehead is just recognizing, not worshiping, the ghost of that atonement doctrine, a persistent doctrine which floats around any time one considers how some depth of suffering or evil has actually or can actually served as means to a better end. So I think eco-theology also needs to attend to that ghost, for it is only some existential experience of environmental crisis that for many serves as the wake-up call. Without the unprecedented floods and fires, droughts, withering heat waves, hitting close to home, we're now in the hottest century on record, the hottest month on record. A couple degrees of warming feel too abstract to compete with more profitable motives. The systemic denialism may now count as the apocalyptic instance of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. I think it's a very good example of it, as in mistaking the abstractions of money for the concrete and the concrete crisis of the climate for the abstract, mistaking the money fallaciously for the concrete. John Cobb's voice echoes in my ear from almost half a century ago when he said to me on a walk, "One hopes that the ecological crisis will get bad enough for enough people to wake up, but soon enough so that it's not too late." Yeah, 40 years ago. Are we getting there? To the awakening and not just the too late? If so, doesn't that exemplify all too urgently how discord can trigger redemptive response, the ghost of salvation through suffering? So yes, as Whitehead says, of the understanding provoked by the discordant multiplicity of actual things, This is how, in his words, the immediacy of sorrow and pain is transformed into an element of triumph. Oh dear, I had just insisted on Whitehead's non-triumphalism. Surely we do not need confidence in a coming triumph of ecociv, but we do need the pain of ecological damage to further provoke the labor of salvation, the work of salvaging, saving Gaia. And in that work, one must always repeat, the pain itself is not what causes the redemption, with or without God's agency. And when we teach Whitehead, I repeat that here. Otherwise, we should let the damage happen. The bifurcation of nature is a monstrous wound, and it's not going to heal itself, to heal naturally, except maybe long after our species goes extinct. In other words, suffering does not redeem, but feeling with the suffering might, for compassion, if tinged by that enjoyment of worthwhileness, can stir active solidarity. Solidarity really does need that edge of enjoyment. Otherwise, motivation collapses, seeing that those most responsible for the damage remain the least vulnerable to it, and seeing that when privileged populations awaken from denialism, they conveniently shift to nihilism, and seeing that those most vulnerable suffer such urgencies that they are often forced into competition with, rather than intersection with, ecological action. Nonetheless, I hold out a bit of hope that this summer's new scale of climate crisis is, as polls are showing, raising consciousness, and might give the beloved a wake-up call. The suffering is necessary, but certainly not sufficient for eco-redemption, which makes possible and is made possible by a solidarity rich in discord. Such, Whitehead avers, is the generalization of a redemption found also in its, quote, very minor exemplification as the aesthetic value of discords in art. Minor then also in the musical sense, and of course I'm thinking of Helmut Maassen and his beautiful tuning of Whitehead to music. I think also of a book, Innocent of Whitehead, Green Media and the Dilemma of Ecological Virtue. Sarah McFarlane Taylor there deploys art eco-socially. In her words, it's like restoring the earth. It's like sharing a juicy novel with our local book group. Our motivation to expend energy digging in, so then organizing, healing, restoring, disrupting, re-inhabiting, remarking, and reinventing is fueled not by the draining energy sources of guilt and duty, but by sustaining storied sources of play and delight. So the values of discords in art can motivate solidarity on behalf of all the threatened earthly beauty. Thus, Bill McKibben writes from Vermont during this very month's catastrophic floods. The crazily raging river a quarter mile from my door scares me, but it also makes me think how stunning it is in its usual form. This planet remains stirringly beautiful, and that beauty must be one of the things that moves us to act. Maybe it's the quiet Whiteheadian influence getting him so clear on this. I end with a flash of current news from my own state. The headline reads, "Saved by Seaweed. Nuns and Native women heal polluted New York waters using kelp." Women from the Shinnecock Indian Nation and the Sisters of St. Joseph, who live on the same Long Island Bay, are now growing and planting kelp together. They do this because it helps to eliminate the carbon and nitrogen that is poisoning their waters. It's also helping to re-enfranchise the tribe. And the women sing to the kelp. One tribal member explains this, saying, "Studies have shown that plants respond well to high-frequency tones." Thus, the discord of nature and culture, and at the same time of differently fragile spiritual cultures, is being lifted in music into the minor exemplification of a local redemption. The triumph is transient, the good news modest. Yet, at least as a metaphor, we hear the discordant multiplicity of things singing out in solidarity, as it does not cease to do among Whiteheadians. Dankeschön.